Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Apostate of Mind, a channel dedicated to critical commentary of the Bible and the Christian religion. I'm Mark Peralta.
And I'm Anonymous. At the foundation of religions around the world are beliefs that are based upon other beliefs that are really assumptions and accepted as true without any evidence or valid reason. In Christianity, there are many things that the Christian doctrine assumes to be true in order for Christianity to work. What are some of those things that are presupposed or accepted as true without evidence?
So in order for Christianity to work, and I think the same goes to Islam and Judaism, you've got to have at least the following 6 presuppositions to be true in order for everything to make sense. Without them, it doesn't work. Number 1, that there's a God. Number 2, the Bible or the Quran or whatever holy book is true and properly translated.
Mm-hmm.
Number 3, that sin exists. Number 4, that free will exists. Okay, free will as opposed to predeterminism, some sort of deterministic existence. Number 5, that we have a souls or some sort of immaterial side to life. And then not only that, but that soul is part of some sort of afterlife, right? That it outlives the physical body.
Mm-hmm.
And number 6, a commitment to a particular religious paradigm. This is more relevant to perhaps not just religions, but traditions, denominations, East or West, Catholic versus Protestant. They each have very unique religious paradigms that are not very determinative. The Bible is not very determinative in certain aspects. And so they each have their own set of theologies that are starkly different that they have to accept. Otherwise, their religious model doesn't really work. So
that's a good point. It doesn't really work because if those beliefs are at the foundation and they're not true, then the other beliefs that are based upon that can't possibly be true. So
That's
tell
right.
me more. You mentioned the first assumption. That there is a God.
That there is a God. So, and with that assumption comes answering the question, where did we come from? Or where did all this come from? Because we are not satisfied with just accepting that perhaps we'll never know where all this came from, that we must have some sort of, that any proposition is better than no proposition at all.
Right. So they assume that it must be God since they don't have other answers. But what are the other possibilities if it isn't God that created us and everything?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the very least, one could also contemplate the possibility of the universe forming itself. Some sort of spontaneous first event that led to other events that over the thousands of years, billions of years, gradually came. And, we'll have to kind of get into what astronomy has to say about that and cosmology. But at the very least, that behind it all, there is some sort of entity, some sort of special being that put that into motion.
Mm-hmm. And I think just as recent as last year, we fully decoded, or scientists fully decoded DNA. And so I think now more than ever, we understand the building blocks of life and how we share it in common with other life. And the evidence seems to be pointing to a commonality of origin of life rather than God creating separate beings or speaking them into life. There's less evidence for that than evidence for evolution.
Yeah, and with that, I'm reminded of the question about purpose. That's one of the main leading questions to any kind of evangelistic conversation is, so, what do you think the purpose of life is? Why are we here?
Mm-hmm.
I think that is also part of what the existence of a God that might have some cosmic purpose for us all that becomes, the accepted presupposition.
Right. It's an assumption that God exists to have a purpose for you. But if you're really looking at what the evidence shows, well, maybe you're here because your parents had sex and those animals are here because their parents reproduced. And these plants are here because their parent plants produce pollen or seeds to replicate. I mean, there's other evidence that points to other reasoning for them to be here.
For sure. And definitely evolution is a scientific fact that has been well demonstrated, that it's predictable, that scientists have been able to show with empirical data, fossil remains, and all kinds of scientific data that evolution actually is a mechanism that we can observe and accept as, hey, this is how we got here.
Yes.
We're no longer contemplating magic or some sort of Gollum spell as a possibility as to how human beings came to be formed. Now we can see, no, wait a minute, there's nothing that was formed. There's an evolutionary process, and here's, more or less where this is possible.
Not to mention that I think that there are a lot of holes in the biblical narrative of the concept of God as the creator. There's some inconsistencies in the telling. There's some explanations that now, with the understanding of with science, we know that it couldn't have happened in that order, in that time frame. So I think some of those assumptions have been proven to be wrong.
Yeah, for sure. And, if you're critical of the Bible when you read it in the creation accounts, you can tell that, hey, perhaps people that wrote this were not really aware of how the universe really was. They just did the best they could with what they thought was the truth, which, if anything, is evidence of the Bible not being an inspired book. Because had it been inspired by a deity that actually knew how the universe was, you'd expect something a little different than Genesis.
Right. And instead, it's evidence of their primitive understanding of how they saw the world. And some of the examples of the differences or the problems with the telling of the biblical narrative of creation is, for example, how was the sun created before the light? And were plants created first or humans? Because there's contradicting points. So there's a few things that, like we said, evidence has proven to not be true.
Yeah, and how the impossibility of there being ever an Adam and Eve. In other words, a first human, female and male and female, that's not possible. The age of the earth. There's people that have actually counted like generations in the Bible to more or less average out the age of this earth. And they concluded that about maybe 6,000 years old.
And what does the evidence say about the age of the earth?
Undeniably that, the universe is more than 12.6 billion years. The earth, 4? I could be wrong. 14, I'm not a scientist, but
I think I've heard a range of 4 and 14 billion years old.
Yeah. So, it is really old. It's really old. And all the evidence points away from a young earth. So if you're still into that, I would, I'd look into it if I were you, because that's really something that Christian theology is presupposing, and the evidence is against that. So
right.
Now, regarding God, there's another side of the existence of a God that created the universe, that has some sort of purpose behind the creation of the universe, but that also that God can be experienced. And that's something that it's very important in the Christian lifestyle, in the Christian environment. If you're going to live the Christian life and be part of a congregation, you're likely going to have to accept these things. Like, for example, that God can, if there's a God, that this God can hear your prayers and understand our language and is listening.
And even know your heart without even hearing your prayer. Yes. And when I do speak to Christians and kind of get to the heart of why they believe what they believe, it often comes down to a feeling or an experience that they had that ultimately only exists in their mind.
Right. Yeah. And you hear things like, well, I felt a presence. What's a presence, really? Either someone's in the room and they're there because you can see them or feel them if you're blind, or they're not. But there's not like a presence of something that's not tangible in some way or another.
Right.
right? Our brain can trick you into thinking that something is there, but is it there or is it not? And if it's there, then that should be demonstrable.
Right.
And if it's not, then you've created a whole new possibility of things being present when they're not. Really? So that God can be experienced that way, that God's watching you, for example.
Yeah.
That's another one. Because if he's not watching, right?
He's keeping track of your sins and your thoughts.
Yeah, he's keeping track. Yeah. Because if it wasn't, think about it, right? If God was not listening, then who cares really what you said or didn't say? Never mind the purpose behind prayers. If he's not listening, then all prayer is futile.
Right.
It's a waste of time. That he can protect you or his angels can protect you, right? That whatever that spiritual realm is, whether it's made of guardian angels or demons or cherubs or whatever, that somehow these things that you can't see, that you can't really feel, can interact with you, with our lives.
Right. I was recently talking to somebody about what they were attributing God protecting them from this tornado. And if you're looking at the evidence, well, the evidence points to that we know that tornadoes are unstable. It's due to unstable weather conditions, and they're unpredictable, and they move side to side and spin. And that's the nature.
The physics behind it.
That's the nature, and that's the nature of a tornado. That alone explains why this place was hit and that one wasn't. And to claim that God is protecting you would also be to claim that when bad things happen, that he wasn't protecting you or wasn't protecting them when the tornado did hit them.
Yeah, and almost always it's the other way around. It's whenever people are saved, that they give the glory and the honor to their God, to their saint, to their whatever. If you think about it, the same logic of how people came to believe those things, that God can save them or they have a guardian angel, is the same logic that people that have one of those rabbit feet as a lucky charm or
a superstition.
Yeah, the little charms that people wear. It's all based on, well, yeah, this was happening and that day I was wearing that charm and nothing happened to me. Therefore, the charm is responsible for.
Right. But can you really attribute that to God, especially when you can also have someone believing in the Christian doctrine have their house completely destroyed in the tornado, and they would still say, well, I'm alive. So they still, like, no matter what happens, if their house is destroyed or their house is protected, they still see it as evidence for God or give glory to God. When really there's no need for a God explanation when the tornado itself explains why some houses were hit and some weren't.
Yeah. And the other thing that happens is something like that being evidence that, say, the Christian God is true because a Christian family was saved from the tsunami or whatever. That's not a good, valid measurement for truth, because other peoples from other parts of the world, from other religions, holding to completely different beliefs, could make the same claims.
True.
Should there be some sort of disaster that they were exempt from.
Right. But what we do know to be true is that good and bad things happen to all sorts of people all over the world, and there's doesn't seem to be a direct correlation with your belief or your actions that serve your religious views having a higher likelihood of being more protected, more blessed than other religions.
Yeah. So and blessing is the counterpart of that same faulty logic, in that when you do receive good things is because your God is blessing you, is he's responsible. How many stories do you hear about people claiming that some angel helped them, right? Like they were rescued off the side of the road and they're like, oh yeah, this must have been an angel from God. Because how else would you explain this person showing up at that very moment to help us without any selfish motives? And so rather than like being thankful that a human being went out of his or her way to do something for them, what they're concluding is that their God sent a messenger to bless them.
Right.
And that becomes a testimonial. You see, so it spins how you're perceiving life.
Definitely.
Yeah. Now, we're not always blessed as believers, as former believers, but you can also be cursed too. So one of those presuppositions is that God can curse you, that you could do something so bad that as a punishment, God can alter your life's outcomes by way of a curse or something magical.
Yes. And if you're applying that blessed, cursed logic using evidence of looking around you, you'd have to conclude, well, maybe God is only blessing Christians in America because they are more blessed than Central America and South America. We see many times Christians living in terrible conditions and having lots of suffering. So I think the reality of what we see around us doesn't really support that concept of God being the provider of blessings and punishment.
Yeah, and it's not really helpful either, because it in many ways it communicates what could be a wrong message. Because the flip side of blessing, which would be something that the community would think that maybe you earned the blessing, or they would at least expect that you're doing something right, and that therefore God's pouring out blessing upon your life, and you're getting this and you're getting that. The flip side of someone that is having an unfortunate life circumstance, that they're not getting the job, that their car keeps breaking down, that they're not finding their wife. They get judged by the community because the false assumption that they could make is that there must be a reason why God isn't blessing them, and why God may be cursing them some way.
That is
to
such
teach
a
him
good
a lesson,
point.
and so that becomes part of what.
And it may lead you to act less humanely to your fellow human. Instead of helping them, you kind of feel like, well, God is giving them what they deserve. God's in charge. God knows them and would be providing for them more if they may be better people.
Oh, absolutely. And that's something that's evident in India, for example, where there's the common, and I know this isn't a Christian thing, but I think it's similar to it, is a cousin of, karma, the concept of karma, that whatever you did in your past lives through reincarnation, the next life, you might end up paying for whatever you did. Like if whatever you didn't end up paying in your present life, you're going to end up paying for it in the next life. So how that could play out is you have people that live in the slums. You have kids that are being raised in major poverty, people that are like in the worst conditions, and the wealthy and the government will refuse to help them in fear of them getting in the way of some sort of karma that should be happening, that they deserve, that should they get in the way of that karma, then they're just going to be prolonging whatever punishment the person deserves. So might as well let them suffer so that they can get through it in a future life, that they'll be rewarded for the suffering that they're experiencing now. So they're banking on an afterlife, and we'll get into that as well, on some sort of redemptive life circumstance that they won't do anything about in the present time.
True. And now, to be fair, in Christianity, there's verses that promote serving and being generous and helping the lowest, I guess you could say. However, there's also the view of God, the punisher, that could also have an impact on how people treat others.
Right.
The other thing that I see a lot, especially during the pandemic, is the idea of God being a healer. Especially, people not wanting to take their vaccines or not wanting to, I know that's controversial, but, people putting their assumption that God was enough to protect them from this virus.
For sure.
Or heal them.
And then you blend that with prayer and how a God is listening. And so you're now asking this God to heal someone. How many times did you hear about like people coming in to do a prayer circle over someone that had cancer or some sort of illness.
Mm-hmm.
And, you thinking that God's doing something.
Right. And many times if they were healed, they were on chemotherapy or taking some treatment to explain how they were healed, not explainable by prayer.
Yeah, I mean, like when the person does recover, what ends up happening is that God gets all the credit. And never mind that the person was in a hospital and received state-of-the-art medical treatment, in many cases.
So there's evidence of other reasons why the person may receive healing other than it pointing to God.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. So like in ancient times, people had no clue that there was such thing as a microbiome and like the immune system and everything that's happening inside the body that you just can't tell by looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
You gotta understand biology, that back in the day, people would be likely to believe in that God may have done something about someone's fever, but maybe the body healed itself.
Right.
There's a lot more to it that nowadays we just keep on insisting, or believers keep on insisting that there can be such thing as a miraculous healing.
Right.
But in reality, what's kicking in is just cognitive bias.
Mm-hmm.
Or confirmation bias.
Right. Correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because you prayed for it and then you got better doesn't mean that the prayer worked and that God gave you that healing.
Yeah. The sad part is that when people inevitably don't become healed.
That's so true.
That it's not like they take points away from God.
No, it's still, he's mysterious and he has his own plan and he'll do what is right, what is predestined for you.
Yeah, that's maybe one of the biggest lies of Christianity is God works in mysterious ways.
And maybe it's not so mysterious. Maybe there's evidence that points to a different reason. Mm-hmm. And that's why God is so mysterious.
Yeah.
Maybe the mystery is that you're assuming he exists.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching.
And until next time, this has been Apostate of Mind.